Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party's question and answer session. Today is October 21st, 2017. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II. I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, chief executive of the Nevada Transhumanist Party, and author of this book, Death is Wrong, which is an illustrated children's book on indefinite human life extension. I would like to point out also, October is Longevity Month. So as a result of this, our Q&A will have a longevity and life extension theme, even though we have 2 hours scheduled for the Q&A, and we would be happy to address other topics as well. Next, I would like to introduce our other participants thus far, and perhaps we will have more of our officers joining. Right now we have Martin van der Kroon, who is our Director of Recruitment. Welcome, Martin. And Singh, who is our new Director of Applied Innovation. Welcome, Sean. We are pleased to have both of you participating today. And before we start with addressing our questions, I wanted to give a brief overview of our activities and our successes over the past 3 months. Our most recent Q&A session was held on July 15th, 2017. And since then, the Transhumanist Party's reach has expanded dramatically. We were represented at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas in late July, as well as at RADFest in San Diego in early August. And furthermore, I gave a virtual presentation to the Vanguard Scientific Instruments in Management, or VSIM, conference in Ravna, Bulgaria in September. And all of these events contributed to a tremendous increase in public awareness of the Transhumanist Party and an extremely positive reception by those who were in attendance, whether they were transhumanists, life extensionists, or other interested individuals who are keeping an open mind about these issues. Furthermore, we have greatly expanded our contingent of officers, and Sean is one of our new additions as Director of Applied Innovation. We also have a new Director of Publication, Kenneth Allum, who has been adding new articles to our website and trying to feature content that informs the public about new scientific advances, as well as scientific concepts that people should be aware of if they're interested in transhumanism and life extension. We have a new Director of Visual Art, Emmanuel Iral, whom I hope to see later in this Q&A session. And he is tasked with spreading paintings, graphic design, other visual content on the website of the Transhumanist Party and on our social media to cultivate a new aesthetic of the future. Then we have a new foreign ambassador program that was established recently, about a month and a half ago. And currently, we have foreign ambassadors from a decent number of countries. We have foreign ambassadors from Bulgaria, from Brazil, from Chile, from England, from India, Nigeria, and Scotland. And we are looking to finalize the appointment of our foreign ambassador from Egypt as well. And the purpose of the foreign ambassadors is to ensure that the transhumanist movement is solidified internationally, because although we are the US Transhumanist Party, we also believe that the advent of indefinite life extension and the technological improvement of the human condition is best achieved through the cooperation of people everywhere. Anyone who can contribute scientific advancements or philosophical ideas or advocacy or art is a worthwhile ally. So ultimately, we seek to transcend the distinctions of nationality or country or boundaries and join with anybody who is willing to assist in our efforts. So with that, I will add two more achievements that we have recently accomplished. One is the publication of our FAQ, which is quite extensive, and it is found on our website at transhumanist-party.org. The FAQ can be readily navigated by individual question, and this is a compilation of common questions about what the Transhumanist Party stands for, the organization of the Transhumanist Party, some of perhaps areas of curiosity that members of the public have raised. We tried to make it reasonably comprehensive. We can't answer every question, but we hope it does answer many common questions. And then the most recent development has been the announcement of our 6th platform exposure period, which will occur for 21 days until November 11th. We have 19 new plank proposals and 3 proposals for amendments to existing planks, which is going to be a new process for us. And we invite public input, suggestions for alternative wording, anything that you think could improve our platform with regard to these issues. And that could include comments of support or comments of opposition for particular proposals. Ultimately, we have democratic elements to our governance, small d democratic elements. So we will take guidance from our members, and we encourage all of our members to vote when we open up our 7-day voting period starting on Saturday, November 11th. So with that, I wanted to open up the opportunity for our officers to give any overviews that they might have of recent developments. Let's start with you, Martin. What are your impressions of how the Transhumanist Party has evolved recently?
Well, first off, we're gaining more traction on Facebook, which is awesome. Especially recently, I think we just hit the what are the impressions called? Page views, if I'm right. What are they called? I always forget. I see the number, but then I forget what it's named. Oh, post reach.
Post reach, yes.
Yes. And we recently hit a post reach of almost 12,000, which was a new height after I think our highest reach was around 8,000. That is really awesome, and I think that is in part due to solid contributions from Kenneth, our new director of publications. So that is really awesome. What else? Well, indeed, we have the Google sites, which was directly from the get-go was used very intensively, and so much so that I had trouble keeping up, but has been a good place, a good forum, if you will, to debate various questions, including the short, mid, and long-term goals of the newest Transhumanist Party. Also, many questions regarding religion or lack thereof, and how we should treat religion. And of course, there are various opinions on that particular subject within the transhumanist community at large, particularly because a segment of it is atheist, and some might be, for lack of a better word, pretty hardcore atheists. And that is everyone's own right, but then you get heated debates, which I very much like, as long as they stay civil. So that was awesome. And what else? Oh, we just hit 250 followers on Twitter, which goes up and down a little bit between 248 and 253 or so, but I hope it will increase all the way up to 500. Not sure if we will reach that before the end of the year, but that would be amazing. And indeed, I do hope that, yeah, that all our members will go and vote for the platform proposals. And indeed, when it comes to the amendments to existing planks, that members will provide their input also beforehand. We already see some interaction and comments on the website to suggest edits or changes to not only the amendments but also the new proposed planks. And I hope that continues on, because we need the dialogue also between ourselves and to continue. Something I'm particularly stoked about is the foreign ambassadors. That is awesome. Not only from the point of view that the US Transhumanist Party and so on, and the ideals of transhumanism might spread, and that we may communicate, interact, and cooperate better with foreign countries and foreign nationals, but also from the perspective that they look at the US with a different view, and in particular to foreign policy, which is something that might affect people from other countries. And as such, I'm not saying we should base our policies on what they say, but it is valuable input to consider overall, to view if it might work or not. And I think that is a really cool aspect where foreign ambassadors and so on can have valuable input. In essence, diversity of thought.
Yes.
Anyways, that was me. Sorry that it was long and dwindling.
Well, thank you, Martin. And those are excellent remarks in terms of diversity of thought and inclusivity. You wrote a great statement in response to the debates over religion that occurred on our Google group, essentially welcoming people of various perspectives regarding religion or lack thereof, as long as we can all stay civil and tolerant, and we share the aims of improving the world through the progress of science and technology. And along these lines, we have a few comments in the chat. Open Source Temple, I think that's you, Sean, mentioned the neo-Buddhists, and Steve Hill mentions the Christian transhumanists and says that they generally seem like good enough folks. So I would reiterate, we welcome people of those perspectives and other perspectives as well. For instance, Jewish transhumanists or Islamic transhumanists or Mormon transhumanists into the US Transhumanist Party in terms of engaging in dialogue with them, seeking policy suggestions from them, seeking content from them, and also exploring areas of common ground. Now, I myself am an atheist. I am not a militant atheist in the sense that I'm not seeking to deconvert anybody, but I am seeking to change the world, the physical, material world in which we reside, by advocating technological breakthroughs that can reverse human aging, that can greatly reduce material scarcity, increase people's liberty and leisure time, prevent conflict, prevent accidents, prevent natural disasters, and other causes of needless loss of life. So anybody who supports those goals, whatever their philosophical foundation, would be an ally in terms of working toward those aims. So then Steve Hill also has shared his perspective. He says, I'm an agnostic scientist. It's the LEAF way. And LEAF, by the way, is the Life Extension Advocacy Foundation, one of our allied organizations, which has been doing great work. They run lifespan.io, which is a crowdfunding platform specifically devoted to longevity research, and it's the first of its kind. Recently, they have completed their fundraising goal for the Mouse Age project. And that project aims to use artificial intelligence in order to run essentially virtual experiments on virtual mice so that real mice don't have to be sacrificed in lab work. And I've been aware for a number of years, unfortunately, of the tragic loss of mouse lives. Even if mice survive a particular experiment, sometimes they're discarded, they're euthanized because of lack of resources. And for me, that is extremely unfortunate. It should be prevented if at all possible. And if there are ways to glean the same knowledge or better knowledge more rapidly without doing that, then that would be an excellent goal. So LEAF, the Life Extension Advocacy Foundation, and Lifespan.io are great organizations to support. Through the good work of Kenneth, whom you mentioned, Martin, we have published several articles from LEAF on our website, including by Steve Hill. So I encourage everyone to go out and read them. Then we have
Steve Hill for writing them, by the way. It's pretty awesome. Yeah. It's really good stuff.
Yes, and Steve responds, yes, and thank you to the U.S. Transhumanist Party for their great support. It is appreciated to have good allies. Wonderful. And we have two comments from Keahi Angarika. As long as you believe in the transhumanist ideals and are willing to help build the world where we all live better, it doesn't matter over much whatever else you might believe in. I completely agree with that.
I don't care if someone would be a Satanist for all, like, or Scientology or something, anything. It doesn't matter if they respect other people. Respect other people to be as they wish to be, and they accept values in the sense of like increasing longevity and healthy lifespans and so on and so forth. It's all awesome to me.
Yes.
Like,
hey, absolutely.
Can you guys?
And then
that's the audio.
Sean, I think you are trying to say something. So let's see. Are you able to speak? I can hear you, but barely.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I'll just try to hold this really close to my mouth. So yeah, I've been wanting to say some stuff, but I wasn't sure if it would be interrupting or if you could hear me or not. So one of the questions I've had, or I've been contemplating, is what we consider to be under the auspices of life extension. Because we talk a lot about the longevity of lives, but I'm not sure if we've really had the conversation about the quality of lives sometimes. Because, I mean, you can live 100 years, but if it's 100 years with the last 50 years as a vegetable, that's questionable, despite the fact that we have that technology. So I've been wondering about things like a lot of diseases that we have that are related to our diets that result in, I guess they have metabolic diseases is how you could say it mostly, but things that can oftentimes result in things like heart disease and Alzheimer's disease, and but mostly gerontological diseases is what I'm focusing on. As I know we've had a lot of, let's extend the telomeres on, sorry.
Yes.
I guess what I'm trying to do is get beyond the length of the lives of the individual cells and try to look, in some cases, obviously this is not contra to anything that you've said so far, but I don't know how much of our messaging has been quality of life messaging, because a lot of it has been about longevity writ large, which is kind of vague in itself. And I also don't mean to diminish any of the achievements of Lifespan.io, and I totally agree that we should minimize the suffering of lives of animals in general. But I do sometimes question how they manage to relations that they run in the computer are similar to an actual mouse. It seems really complex. I know we've, totally decoded the genomes of mice and create mice with green feet now. I actually saw this really interesting thing about CRISPR where they actually bred mice with green feet and then use CRISPR after the fact to remove the gene for the green feet from the mice and then eventually the skin cells fluff off and whatever, and they stop being green. And that's how they determine the precision and accuracy of CRISPR, which is, super interesting. But I am wondering how they would do something that complex without using actual mice.
Yes, and those are good points. Now, Steve Hill responded to your first point, Sean. The aim of rejuvenation biotechnology is to increase healthy lifespan. The aim is quality and quantity here, which is a deviation from current medicine, which often keeps you alive but sick. And I think that is, in a sense, implicit in the pursuit of life extension, that the life extension would need to be healthy. It would need to be youthful life extension, because without making the body and the cells more youthful, it would not be possible to meaningfully extend maximum lifespans beyond where they are today. And most supercentenarians, even record-setting ones, die at around 115, 116 years. A few have lived beyond that up to 122 years, which was the record set by Jean Calment. But there is, right now, of course, no way to just extend frail lifespan beyond those maximums. If we want to exceed those maximums, then we need to turn back the aging clock. And of course, that would be essentially more youthful years of life. So I agree. It's not a good idea to spend more years with Alzheimer's disease or with heart disease or with great vulnerability to cancer. But aging is kind of the common set of causal factors that precipitates most of those diseases, to this degree that somebody who is biologically young is hundreds of times less vulnerable to them than somebody who is biologically old. And Steve Hill expressed agreement with that. He says, yeah, no point in giving people another 20 years in a wheelchair. No one wants that. Speaking of which, advances in prosthetic technology, exoskeletons, artificial limbs will help people also get out of their wheelchairs and recover from paralysis, which would be another wonderful set of development.
If I may add, is I agree with Sean on the part that we have focused a lot on longevity. Obviously, well, at least to us, obviously, longevity comes with being healthy and youthful. I do think that the general public might not naturally make that connection as we do, in the sense of that we could advocate to them for longevity, which already for the vast majority of people is a complicated term, because they usually just say getting old, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but they don't necessarily make the connection that it would be youthful. They think, okay, they want us to get older, but what they think is that with that you automatically become more frail, and instead of we want you to become older because we want to keep you healthy and youthful. And I think that is something we could make an improvement in communicating that. Like, hey, yes, we would like to give you the option of being able to get older, but not without the precondition of being healthy and youthful. AKA, maybe we should actually focus on keeping people healthy and youthful, which then over time becomes the mindset of, if we're healthy and youthful, the chances are we get older.
Mm-hmm. And Keahi Angarika says, in response to that, such as the popular media portrayal, I think in reference to what you described, Martin, and Aubrey de Grey calls this the Tithonus error. Tithonus was Greek Titan, I believe, who was the lover of the goddess Eos, who begged Zeus to give him eternal life without giving him eternal youth. And he became increasingly frail, and he shriveled up into a tiny size. And yet, so this has been a kind of popular conception over the ages. Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels wrote about the Struldbrugs, which was a population of humans that never died, but they did senesce, and they became very frail and very unhappy, to say the least. So I think this idea that getting older necessarily means getting frailer. One, it originated in a time when medicine wasn't able to do very much about that. And moreover, it originated as a kind of comforting thought. People who encountered this mythology would think, well, yes, we're mortal, our lives are finite, our lives are short, but maybe it wouldn't be worthwhile to live much longer, because see what happened to Tithonus, see what happened to the Struldbrugs. And yet, I do agree it's important to correct that error, because that's a basic factual error that people have about rejuvenation biotechnology. That's not even, say, a moral disagreement or a political disagreement. That's a misapprehension of what the goal of the life extension project would be. And Steve Hill remarks, we always pitch from the following: 1, cures for diseases; 2, health; 3, independence. Longevity is a possible outcome, but we have found the public react best to those 3 points. So I do think it's worthwhile to emphasize what one can do with extra healthy lifespan. And by the way, we have BJ Murphy joining our conversation here. BJ Murphy is our director of social media. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. Apologies, having some spotty issues over here with the Wi-Fi for some reason.
Oh, no problem. So the conversation that we are having right now relates to the presentation of life extension to the public. And it has been remarked a lot of people in the general public don't understand yet the connection between increased longevity and increased youthful and healthy lifespans, and they commit the Tithonus error, which I described. We've had a few more comments on this. Super Fin Guy says, not to mention that in the media, mortals are almost always portrayed as evil. And Keahi Angarika says, we should use that term more often as a way of approaching it. After all, we usually refer to it as indefinite life extension instead. And yes, indefinite life extension has been the term of art to use for our goal. Several people, including Aubrey de Grey, don't like the term immortality because they think it presupposes certain religious connotations or invulnerability, and indefinite life extension is not invulnerability to all causes of death. But there are other perspectives on immortality. For instance, Michael West likes to use that term, biological immortality, when referring even to existing organisms like germline cells within mammals, which are essentially biologically immortal in the sense that they can replicate indefinitely without their telomere shortening, without becoming damaged over time, which is how each new generation of animals isn't born frailer and more decrepit than the previous generation. So the term biological immortality is also used to denote that, the capacity to constantly rejuvenate an organism. So BJ, what are your thoughts?
Real quick,
Yes, Sean.
more off the point. There was one point that I really wanted to make like 20 minutes back, but
Okay.
so we talk about a lot about how the cells, you just talk about how the cells rejuvenate. And I was talking about something slightly different, and this is why I felt like the difference between longevity and wellness was kind of muddled, and you said it was a fallacy. But when I was talking about the things that people call things that cause disease, Alzheimer's isn't caused by cells ceasing to replicate properly. Alzheimer's is called by improperly folded bacteria, which accumulate in the brain as plaques from basically people have shitty diets sometimes. And there's also things that can be in those diets that cause cancerous formations. But more to the point, it's during the normal process of generating energy in the brain. If you use really crappy inputs, you know, the that crappy diet that we're talking about, they will cause the buildup of certain types of plaques. If you literally don't eat certain types of foods, those plaques either don't build up or take vastly longer to build up. So this is the difference that I'm talking about, where it has nothing to do with the biology's way of renewing itself, but in fact has to do with the agents that you put into your body, the food that you eat, or the things or the nutrition that you don't get that can cause misfolded proteins in this case of Alzheimer's, which then leads to Alzheimer's disease, which actually doesn't have anything to do with telomeres lengthening at all. And that's kind of what I was trying to get to, was that we have a lot of diseases, and heart disease is another one, where this has to do with the types of fats that are in your diet. When you have the types of fats that are, specific mostly to junk foods, but not specific to whole foods, even though they both have fat. And this is a whole argument of what is fat and what's good fat and what's bad fat. And I know this is a strange educational health eating type of thing, but the point that I'm trying to make is that gerontological diseases are totally the body failing to renew itself properly. But what I'm talking about is toxins from the environment that are introduced into the food supply unknowingly through real shitty quality control and sometimes bad science, which is, I'm not sure if we want to have that conversation about what constitutes as bad science right now. But the point being that I felt, at least for our international groups, one way that we can really help them gain in popularity is by distributing literature as such about common mistakes that people make in their diets, which can lead to rapid aging by having highly basically toxic diets, if you want to look at it like that. When you look at alcohol in the brain acting the same way as high fructose in the brain, except you don't have a natural system for telling you when you've had too much high fructose, then that leads to quite a few metabolic disorders, and like nobody knows this. And then at the same time, all these countries where we have international ambassadors don't know these things, but they are where the cheapest and crappiest foods go, and then we end up having a bunch of followers that are idiots.
Well, now I think it's incontrovertible that diet contributes to health, and premature death is often caused by problems with people's diets. You mentioned heart disease. However, also in terms of later in life, the problems you discussed with protein misfolding are actually addressed in Aubrey de Grey's taxonomy of the 7 principal types of aging-related damage. And what's interesting also is when Alzheimer's disease manifests itself, by, I believe, age 85, about half of individuals who survive to that age have some symptoms associated with Alzheimer's disease. So at the very least, biological senescence is fertile soil, metaphorically, for the emergence of these conditions, and likewise with heart disease. So a person who is 30 is very unlikely to have a heart attack, even if their diet is atrocious. A person who is 60 or 80 is more likely to have a heart attack, even if they live generally healthy lives, because the overall defense mechanisms of the body are beginning to fail. So Super Thin Guy says, in response to this, not entirely true. The body has defense mechanisms against residue buildup that increasingly fail as we age. And with regard to this, Steve Hill says, this is also addressed in the Hallmarks of Aging, a similar repair-based approach to aging inspired by SENS. And one other thing to consider also is diet tends to be still a somewhat controversial area, in the sense that apart from the basics, like don't eat 5,000 calories a day unless you burn that much, don't have a diet entirely composed of Twinkies, there is very little agreement. There's very little agreement, even among scientists, among nutritionists, about what the appropriate diet is. My own view is diversification, especially in the absence of detailed knowledge about the provenance of each food, is probably the best way to protect oneself, along with moderation. Having a caloric balance, unless one is actively trying to lose weight or to gain weight, because that way one doesn't get too much of any one thing if that one thing ends up being harmful. And that being said, other people have different approaches. Some people follow a kind of paleo diet. Some people actually favor carbohydrates or are vegans or vegetarians. And really, in terms of the outcomes, there's a great degree of variation. But ultimately, I think the amount of variation is still within the parameters that we observe today. So it would be very uncommon for diet alone to extend someone's lifespan by 20 years, say. And what we're trying to do is get technologies made available that could even reverse the effects of bad diet on people. Because, yes, it would be ideal if everybody ate in a healthy manner, but even for those who don't, we want to save them if at all possible, because they have valuable things to contribute to the world and their lives are valuable in themselves. I want to go to BJ to see what he has to say on the set of issues that were discussed.
Well, let me just first bring it back to the discussion of the sort of controversy of using certain terms and describing what exactly we're aiming for here, whether it's indefinite life extension or immortality. In my own personal view, for the longest time, I've sort of been opposed to the term immortality, specifically for the reason that it always came off as this sort of authoritarian terminology where to be immortal is to be unable to die, and to be unable to die relinquishes that individual's decision in the matter. And for us as transhumanists, for those who aim for indefinite life extension, we're not here to dictate what each individual will decide upon, what their ultimate longevity is, whether they wish to go to live up until they're around 80 years old or 100 or 150. Maybe they want to live like Methuselah or the mythological character at 1,000 years. You know, that should be up to the individual. It should be seen as like almost as an extension upon what Dr. Jack Kevorkian did by bringing a decision in the matter for patients who wish to die at their own behest. We're simply adding life at the end of this. And that decision should be the ultimate quest for us as transhumanists, as opposed to dictating people in the same way that our own biological clocks have been dictating whether we live and die and when we live and die. So immortality was always, it just didn't seem accurate in what exactly we were aiming for as a movement and as individual members in this community. As for methods of achieving indefinite life extension, as people have been talking about, you know, diets can be great. They're all different sorts of ways a certain individual can help lengthen their lives up until the point where technology reaches that moment where we can begin reversing the aging process in and of itself. And diets can help. I have a great deal of respect for people like Maria Konovalenko, who had written the Longevity Cookbook, which she tried doing the most scientifically accurate cookbook as possible for people to try and follow, that to a certain extent adhere to a strict science-based diet, one that wasn't flooded with any of the popular food fads that sort of biased a lot of people's opinions, whether that varied from the paleos to the gluten-frees, which isn't to say these weren't positive things for individuals, but in terms of a general population, these food fads really didn't do anything other than be what it is, a food fad. It was nothing more than populism and trying to keep an observation of how food affects us and our means of achieving longevity, it needs to be strictly science-based. And if anybody's interested, they should check out the Longevity Cookbook. That might be of interest and of help to them as well.
Yes, and as I understand it, the Longevity Cookbook is currently in progress, but the first chapters have been released. There was a crowdfunding initiative several years ago that was successful, and the first few chapters are available for free online. People who helped with the crowdfunding, such as myself, are at some point going to receive an entire version of the Longevity Cookbook.
Hopefully.
I'm looking forward to that. And I also think it's important with regard to diet to consider in essence to what extent there is just a response to the paradigms of the day, as you mentioned, BJ. There was at one point a low-fat craze that was fueled by the USDA's food pyramid, and then in response to that, there was the Atkins diet and the paleo movement, and some people found that to be helpful. For other people, it didn't do very much, but I think those people who found it to be helpful, to a certain extent, found the discipline or the, let's say, limitation of caloric intake to a reasonable amount to have the greatest effect. Because if somebody just ate whatever and then they shifted to some system, and that system has some good elements about it, whether they're arrived at scientifically or just through, say, trial and error, or through some sort of common sense restraint, yes, they're going to see a benefit from it. And to the extent that we can offer advice as the Transhumanist Party, I think it should be advice that is kind of a big tent, in the sense that we recognize there are many different approaches. We're not going to take a side, say, in the paleo versus vegan debate, because that's like a trench warfare issue. And the people who are really invested in it are not going to be convinced one way or the other. But what we can say is people should take care of themselves, and one of the ways in which they should take care of themselves is through good diet, again, to help themselves survive to the point where longevity, escape velocity is possible, and where medical treatments might reverse any of the incidental effects of what they happen to have eaten in the past. And in response to that, we've had a lot of discussion here. I wanted to go back a bit to a comment that Rich Lee made. He said, I think the public would get behind life extension 100% when broken into components. Hair that does not gray, skin that does not wrinkle, bones that do not become brittle, muscles that regain strength. And that's an interesting thought, because we see a lot of people today pursuing what one would consider cosmetic improvements, people who dye their hair, people who apply various lotions to their skin, and they want to look younger. Biologically, they don't become younger by doing that, but at least they preserve a certain appearance. And also people who exercise, who keep physically active later in life, which does affect their muscle strength, it does affect their endurance, it does affect various other vital metrics. So that definitely, I think, improves health.
Well, another thing I think, sorry for interrupting there.
Oh, sure.
I think that is something that could gain attention, is that over time we will be able to genetically alter, or perhaps through gut bacteria, I don't know, but in the sense of life extension, is to lower the possibility of obesity, or lower the average percentage of body fat at all. Because if we, like with technological advances over time, we will probably be able to engineer a genome, or a piece of DNA, a chromosome, whatever, to ensure that, yeah, people basically can't get more than 10% body fat. Just that's it. That's your limit. and everything else will just be shed off by your body. Or in the sense, yes, muscle strength. There's a huge difference in how much muscle one can make between different individuals. If we take, for example, Flex Wheeler, which was a I think he was a Mr. Olympia. Not entirely sure on that one, but he participated in a Mr. Olympia contest. This guy could eat pizza right before a competition, and he would have like practically zero body fat. He needed a trainer, not because he wasn't gaining muscle. No, he was too lazy. That's why he needed a trainer. Everyone else needed a trainer to actually get the maximum amount of muscle, and he was actually gaining muscle pretty fast, and he wasn't getting fat while all the other bodybuilders were eating brown rice and broccoli. He was eating a salami pizza or whatever. And something like that, if we can, well, not exactly that everyone becomes Mr. Olympia or Mrs. Olympia for that matter. I don't think there's Mrs. Olympia, but whatever. But that we can naturally, or through DNA changes, we can make people automatically more healthy in that process, that it's easier to gain muscle, or it's harder to gain fat, and so on and so forth. That would help. Another thing would be digestion. Like the digestive system of a human is about 70% effective or efficient. That's not particularly good, at least not if we compare it to vultures, which have like a 99 or 98%. That would actually save us a lot of food on the planet. Imagine a 20% increase of energy use efficiency. We would have to eat 20% less. That alone will probably save the planet. If we go on, like, with eating less, we need less land to raise crops, so on and so forth. Just in that sense, I think that diet and later on genetic modifications combined with diets might help a lot in keeping us healthy.
Yes, and these are good ideas. By the way, as an aside, this is another reason to like vultures. Now, vultures have a bad reputation, but they are eminently useful animals. They are essentially the janitors of the natural world, and they clean up unseemly scenes, but they don't actually kill anything. So they are very benign creatures as compared to the creatures that have let's say a lot of admiration and popular imagery, like eagles and hawks and lions, who are vicious carnivores. Vultures don't actually hurt the creatures that they eat. They just come in to clean up afterward. So this is a good word for vultures. But I think
we'll make sure they're our mascots. They're in transhumanist pep rallies. We'll have a big running around. That'll be great.
Yes.
No, what Martin was talking about is, this isn't, people need to understand that these types of possible solutions aren't as far away as people may believe. Like here recently, it was like a few months back, there was a story that was making waves throughout the scientific community. Was a new study that was coming out of the Columbia University Medical Center, where researchers were they created this medicated microneedle skin patch, where on lab mice, and what the skin patch was doing was turning energy storing white fat into energy burning brown fat, while raising the body's metabolism. And what this did was not only treat obesity, but also combat it against diabetes. And granted, this is on specifically mice, so it's in a limited regulated setting. But the fact that they were able to achieve something as significant as this does tell us that we are aiming in a direction where we can start treating these types of issues that doesn't necessarily have to be as limited as they are today, where people are saying, well, you gotta eat this certain way, or you gotta work out this amount of time in a given day. We're providing actual technical scientific solutions where we can address this here and now, just like we would address the common flu.
Yes, and this is where the Transhumanist Party is distinctive and can offer perspectives that, at the very least, complement sound dietary advice. But we have a lot of people giving dietary advice today, and some of it is good, some of it is perhaps untested or conflicts with other dietary advice. But what we can say is, through technology, we may get rid of the problem whereby so many people even have to pay as much attention to diet. We can imagine a future transhuman organism where perhaps, let's say it has nanobots in the bloodstream, and those nanobots can go and clean out any of the junk that accumulates from eating any particular type of food. So that at that point, food essentially becomes an activity perhaps for sensory enjoyment only. And in terms of nutrition, maybe people will take a pill that will give them the daily requirements as customized to their individual bodily makeup, and then food might become something consumed incidentally in addition to that, if somebody wants to have that experience. Or maybe there would be haptic simulations of food where one's taste buds might be triggered in a certain way that corresponds to consuming a particular food item, but one wouldn't actually be physically consuming it. So those are the kinds of possibilities that I think transhumanist thought is uniquely situated to explore. I wanted to also mention certain comments that were made along these lines in terms of how the public sees the pursuit of life extension. Keahi Angarika says that he agrees with Rich Lee, but also believes we need to make it something the public can get closer to. Currently, it is just something abstract for most people and an idea restricted to lab spaces. And I think perhaps the antidote to that is to point out more of the advances like the ones you were mentioning, BJ, where there are specific technologies on the horizon that could reverse effects that most people would commonly recognize as bad. Like if there was some device that you could put on yourself to metabolize blood sugar and effectively render diabetes no longer a problem, I'm sure tens and hundreds of millions of people are going to be attracted to that concept. It would dramatically change their quality of life. And having that relevance articulated, I think, is very important.
And at the same time, making sure that these technologies are affordable to people as well, because there's also that common fear of, well, what will these technologies be available to everyone? Will they be democratized to everyone, as opposed to, as Freeman Dyson would say, simply become new toys for the rich?
And I think there's going to be an evolution in terms of the availability of those technologies. Right now, even if you're wealthy, it's difficult to access them because they're in experimental stages, so they may be used on mice, or one has to be in a clinical trial group. One of the aims of the Transhumanist Party is to accelerate that process between the development of a treatment and its deployment for the general public. And right now, one of the biggest obstacles in the US is the approval process with the Food and Drug Administration, where it takes on average 10 to 15 years for a lot of treatments to get from the stage where they're developed to the stage where they're available to consumers. So anything that shortens that time frame also accelerates the advent of the day when most people in the general public would be able to get an affordable treatment. But I agree, it is a concern.
It took them 18. It took them 18 years to approve genetically modified salmon. So that that alone, it shows just how slow the process is of something as innocuous as a genetically modified salmon that allows it to be a bit larger than its predecessors. Imagine what it's like for common drugs that can actually help people.
Yes, yes, and I think a lot of the problem is with the mindset of the precautionary principle that something should never be approved unless you know that it's not going to cause harm. But one of the ways in which we find out the effects of a particular substance is by having empirical data. It's not possible to foresee in the abstract every conceivable harm that could result. And in order to gather that empirical data, I think we need people with various risk tolerances and people with various circumstances in life. Some people who are terminally ill or suffering a lot from a particular disease are going to be willing to take more risks than you or I would in a healthy state. And I think as part of respecting their autonomy, their freedom of choice, we need to allow them to take these treatments, and then by virtue of taking these treatments, they also generate data that scientists could use to understand any side effects, understand ways to improve the treatments, so that by the time they get to the general public, it's not just the results of a few clinical trials that will be known, it will be the effects on a large subset of the general public. And there are countries that are moving in that direction. Japan recently enacted reforms that would essentially allow drug manufacturers to market substances before they've passed the final clinical trials for efficacy. And as part of that distribution of these substances, they gather data on efficacy that can later be used to finalize the approval process. So these kinds of reforms are highly promising, and we do have some proposed planks in our recently released exposure period that do address these issues. So let us continue with the conversation that is in the chat. Keaki Angarika says, some citizen science and more opportunity for engagement would be a huge boon to the entire movement. Even biology majors at the university cannot work out how to get involved. And I would say perhaps the best person to offer insights into that is Rich Lee, who is our biohacking advisor, who is participating in the comment thread right now, because he has knowledge of efforts in the biohacking arena. He shared with me some news recently, and hopefully I may be able to integrate them into a more general statement of support for this kind of citizen science. One interesting development, and we still don't know what will become of it, has been the self-administration of an HIV vaccine by an individual in association with Ascendance Biomedical, whose founders I've actually met and conversed with at some length, but they're trying to make these experimental treatments more widely available to people, and this was a recent milestone. But with the increased affordability of the materials for conducting such experiments, we are seeing a lot more citizen science and outright biohacking, where people are modifying their own biology or creating certain technological augmentations to their own bodies. And again, talking about risk tolerance, some people have more of it, some people have less of it. The people who have more of it are conducting these experiments. They're generating data for the rest of us to consider, and that's how science advances, and that's how medicine advances, and we wish them all the best in terms of the new abilities that they might gain or the diseases that they might be able to cure or ameliorate.
We're going to see a lot more of that as well, though, because it originally, well, I'm not sure I would say originally, but it really started gaining speed when Liz Parrish first announced that she was going to be patient zero for the first ever gene therapy or anti-aging gene therapy, where she administered onto herself. That was revolutionary at the time. And then here recently we had with the HIV injection alongside Josiah Zayner, who had released a DIY CRISPR kit for people to use, and he injected himself for myostatin, and that right there is going to be opening up the floodgates for a whole new citizens-based genetics revolution that we haven't seen in the history of our species, or any species for that matter. We have full control of what's going to take place in our genetic structure and our biological code, and that's going to open up a whole in terms of science and in terms of participatory science, that's going to be a big step for our species.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And speaking of other emerging technologies on the horizon, Steve Hill points out senolytics is the #1 imminent technology now in human trials. This has potential to treat many diseases, and people are starting to get excited about them. So there's the connection to essentially getting the public on board and engaged. And in terms of what you mentioned before, BJ, Steve Hill notes, yes, the #1 fear we have found recently is cost. It used to be it cannot be done. Now it can be done, but we won't afford it. Only the rich will afford it. Steve Hill also points out Better Humans is running a series of N=10 trials for senolytics. So I believe that means there are 10 participants in the clinical trial. Keaki Angarika points out that the concerns or the skepticism about life extension is worsened by the general fear of the public. Most GMO crops are still not accepted in Europe despite decades of data for safety and efficacy. This is actually one area in which the United States is far ahead of Europe in terms of scientific and technological progressivism. In Europe and a lot of countries, GMOs are banned. And in the United States, essentially trillions of portions of GMOs have been served to the general public without discernible adverse health consequences. And if only people could overcome common prejudices and fears and look at the empirical data and look at the actual genetic modifications in question that were made, they would recognize that there is no basis to fear genetically modified organisms. Now, Sean, do you have thoughts in relation to the areas that were discussed recently?
No, I mostly agree with the sentiments that have been given.
Okay, great, great. So now we have a bit more to follow up on. Rich Lee jokes that the one true diet ordained by God is bugs. I wonder if there are any people who seriously hold that particular perspective.
Well, it's interesting. When I was at MoogFest, I believe it was 2015, perhaps. In fact, Rich Lee was there as well. We were both doing the same conference with Neil Harbison and them. And when, as being a guest there, as guest speakers, we were given these little packets of whatever things, books. And one of the things that they gave us were these cricket bars. And it was fascinating because it was the first time I ever was going to try insects. And I was like, okay, because I had the cricket bar with the Soylent drink next to it. I was like, okay, I'm going to definitely experiment with it. And surprisingly, the cricket bar wasn't that bad. It actually tasted like a sweet mushroom almost. So if you're into mushrooms, it had a nice taste to it. I was like, okay, I can see myself eating crickets in the future, maybe. And so long as it keeps tasting like this, I'm okay with it.
Yes, it's interesting too because to a certain extent, at least from a moral standpoint, insect death is far more acceptable than mammalian death in terms of, at the very least, the emotional impact that it has on us. Yet from a cultural standpoint, most of us are far more comfortable with eating, say, cows or pigs or chickens than insects. And that includes myself. I will eat a hamburger. I will eat chicken. I will eat fish. I would not at this point eat a cricket. But it's interesting.
Oh, come on, Gennady. No, you want one.
And I say at this point because the events of my life, if they've shown me anything, they have shown how radically uncertain the future can be, and that includes one's own future. So I don't rule it out. But I wanted to make the comment that it seems to mostly be a cultural aversion, as far as I'm aware. That is to say, consuming certain insects at least doesn't seem to carry adverse health effects, but of course one with any new food should tread carefully and learn about it and investigate what it could do. Now, Keaki Angarika says he notes there are many trials, but they take so long, and he asks, why is it so slow? And, well, I think part of it is science is hard and discovery is hard, and it takes a lot of trial and error to get to a treatment that works. But I think the FDA approval process and the artificial increase in expense that it entails is also one big reason. Another big reason is the lack of public support and the lack of funding, which scientists like Bill Andrews and Aubrey de Grey have repeatedly lamented. And Keaki Angarika says, the insect bars are great and really show what you can do to make things more palatable. They don't look or taste like cricket, which is a good stepping stone. So, okay, if there's, let's say, an incremental way to get into insect consumption, for those who are interested, then the insect bars are a way to do that. We seem to have lost Martin, but he joined us back. So hello, Martin, once again.
Sorry.
Oh, no problem. Do you have any thoughts on insect consumption or anything related to the discussion thus far?
Well, I think it depends on a lot on culture as well. I mean, for many people in the world, horse is a no-go. This is not for all cultures. Italians are not averse to horse meat, neither are Dutch, by the way, although we mostly only eat it on bread. But, for example, and Alexander might know about this, is Kazakhs eat a lot of horse meat. But not only that, they also, well, I mean, it's not a standard, not anymore, but they also drink fermented horse milk. I mean, most of us don't even know what, like, wouldn't even consider regular horse milk a thing, let alone then fermented horse milk, and so on. So it's a very cultural thing. I mean, in China, you can eat snake, and it's not a big deal. If you get served a snake in Nevada in a restaurant, you're gonna raise an eyebrow.
Well, in Nevada, it's interesting because let's say there are a lot of people with an experimental disposition. In many circles, I would be considered highly conservative in Nevada.
Okay.
But I mean, you could probably go to Las Vegas and find snake being served somewhere.
Probably. Yeah,
yes.
But that's just because they want to be obscure and stuff.
And good luck trying to get people, convincing people to have horse meat here in the United States. It's that's a big no-go. Apparently, we're okay with cows, but when it comes to horses, we're not very in favor of it. We had that, there was like that scandal not that long ago, a few years back with Taco Bell, where they got, one of the brands was, they got in trouble because they were using horse meat as an alternative. And that caused a big ruckus over it. And for me personally, I was like, well, you know, as much as I want to try and alleviate as much harm on non-human animals, the horse meat wasn't that bad, so I can't complain. But still, I can understand why some people might find it a bit problematic. As you said, there is certain cultural issues to it as well, and people just don't have. They just view certain animals differently as we do.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Go ahead, Sean.
An interesting point I wanted to make is I have been known to be a picky eater, but I've never really cared about the origin of what I eat as much. I mean, other than trying to eat less meat in general. But what I mean to say is I've always focused on things like texture, which is, I know, a bit odd, but, and this is kind of how I want to tie it back into the horse meat thing, is like, so what it means is for a really long time, people were well, for some amount of time, probably more than a year, people were eating horse meat and didn't know what it was. Well, they didn't know that it was horse meat, and they were fine with it. And this is how I kind of approach the insect as food issue. When it's turned into a bar or a powder or something else that doesn't actually physically resemble an insect, I don't think most people would have an issue eating it unless they knew it was actually insects. But even then, for me, the thing that's been making me not want to eat insects is the fact that they tend to just, hey, let's just throw a couple of these into a pan and fry them whole, and it's all crunchy and sharp, which you can feel on your tongue. I was like, so yeah, no, powdering them is a great idea, just like how McDonald's gets away with pink slime because no one knows what it is, and it's just reshaped into something that looks like chicken nuggets.
Yes.
And
those are
the point being,
yes.
Wanted to be with the presentation and the consistency of how it tastes in your mouth rather than the origin of the actual foods.
Those are very good points. And I will say I have some affinity to that perspective, Sean, because I am a meat eater, but I want my meat to resemble as little as possible the animal it came from, so that I do not have to think about death when I consume my food. Of course, I wrote a book called Death is Wrong, and I not only have a moral and philosophical aversion to death, I have a visceral aversion to death. I do not like to be in the presence of anything that looks like it is dead. So when I eat my meat, I also want it to be as consistently textured as possible. I want it to be in nice geometric shapes. I do not want it to look like an actual animal. And some might say, well, it's because I'm trying to perpetuate a cognitive dissonance. Maybe I am, but suffice it to say, if lab-grown in vitro meat becomes readily available, even if it's a little bit more expensive, I will happily consume that over meat taken from actual animals. And I do think the point regarding the presentation of insects is well taken. I wouldn't want to eat something that looks like an actual dead insect either. I'll also say Keahi Angarica says rattler is a tradition in parts of the West. So apparently they do eat snakes. Horse meat, on the other hand, would probably be taboo in Nevada because there's a large wild horse population, especially in northern Nevada, especially on land owned by the Bureau of Land Management. And there are a lot of vocal advocates for the wild horses, for protecting them, because the BLM has sometimes been rounding them up and even killing them in mass, and a lot of people are upset over that. So I would say consumption of horse meat out here would be taboo. Snakes, maybe not so much. Anyway, BJ, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just gonna make note of, I agree with the idea of presentation as well, and it's an interesting point, because it's one of those things that it's one of those interesting criticisms that over here in the United States we have a tendency of receiving, where if you travel around Europe, you eat their dishes, there is a great sense of presentation in the way that they produce their food and how they present it to people and make it palatable for people. Here in the United States, we don't really emphasize too strongly on presentation all that much. We focus on all these other menial aspects of food that are honestly irrelevant to what exactly we're looking for. We want to try to make it as healthy as possible and as palatable, like visual-wise, as possible. But for some reason, we tend to focus on the exact contrary, and that makes it a bit more problematic for us in how we provide food and present it to people and try to convince them, hey, this is the future of food. But if you can't even give them a good presentation of it, it's a bad first impression. So it's one of those things that here in the United States in particular, we have to work on, especially.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Now, I also think one of the issues that we have, in essence, is, and this relates to the entire array of subjects we discussed. For most people, they have a certain, let's say, horizon of possibilities that is accessible to them. And people can make different choices with regard to food, with regard to physical activity, with regard to what products they purchase in the store. But say with experimental treatments, they don't know how to access them. They might not be aware of exactly what is out there, what is being tested, what they can do to help. And I do think that is a barrier. Because if you could buy, say, a patch at a store that could help you metabolize blood sugar, and you could just stick it on, and it reduces your probability of getting diabetes by 90%. I'm sure most people would buy one, especially if it were inexpensive. But right now, maybe they don't see it on the horizon. So what can be done to enable them to see it? And this is an open question to anyone who wants to tackle it.
Well, when I was doing work with Planetary Resources, for those that don't know, that's the asteroid mining company that was founded by Peter Diamandis. One of the things that we ended up doing was for mostly funding for a space telescope that they were working on at the time, but we ended up receiving a little bit more funding, which we used to help bring about what was called Asteroid Zoo. And that was a citizen science-based project that people go online and they received live data of images of Earth's orbit, and they would be able to help out and participate in locating possible near-Earth asteroids. And they presented it in a way, again, we come back to presentation. They presented it in a way where it was not only important, but it was fun. It was something that you could do whenever you have spare time. And if you can make science fun again for people, to show them that it's not just this boring, monotonous thing that you have to do in a lab with a white coat, that science can be fun and that it can be both fun and important, then that presentation of a citizens-based science, of getting people involved in the process and gain access to these resources, we could probably go a lot further than we are normally. We just need to start figuring out the way that we present these citizen-based science projects as well.
Yes, and those are extremely good points. Go ahead, Sean.
One suggestion I would make is find either a different thing to name them other than insect-based proteins. I mean, there's so many euphemisms for high fructose corn syrup. I'm sure we could come up with some euphemisms for insect-based protein. And then I think using it as a secondary ingredient in a lot of things, like, you'd sometimes use types of flour as a thickener to increase thickness of your dough, or sometimes even jello or other things. So I guess trying to use them, first off, naming them differently, and then using them as secondary ingredients rather than primary ingredients into enough things that it becomes a primary ingredient. I'm trying to imagine, like, quarter of crickets or something, cricket powder, or utilizing it as a thickener in Jello, or Jello made of cricket powder. I don't know, but yeah, definitely that type of.
As some people might still be thrown off by the idea of a handful of crickets as part of the recipe.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting also, currently existing analogy to what you mentioned, Sean, is the fact that a lot of gelatin is still made out of horse hoofs, and yet for most people that is not a deterrent from consuming gelatinous products. Now, it's interesting also, the US Transhumanist Party in Section 24 of its platform does support a complete prohibition on the killing of non-contagious, non-aggressive dogs, cats, dolphins, whales, elephants, horses, tortoises, parrots, and primates, for the reason that these are the most intelligent of the non-human animals. And there is a hierarchy of sentience and intelligence. And Sean, you helped draft the hierarchy that's contained in our preamble, whereby unaided human beings are at level 5 of sentience, but there are a lot of animals that are, for instance, at level 4. And I do think there is a moral distinction between consuming something that is at level 4 and consuming something that is at a much lower level, in the sense that if we were to look at it from a purely moral standpoint and get rid of cultural considerations altogether, eating an insect would be more palatable than, say, eating a pig. But eating a pig would be more palatable than eating a dog or a cat. And there was a debate on the chat between Keaki Angarika and Superfin Guy. Keaki Angarika advocated eating more horses, dogs, cats, and other species if they exceed the demand for other uses. Superfin Guy points out it's not only about social issues, but objectively we don't want to kill or eat intelligent animals or even the type of protein that we eat. And then they had a debate about whether pigs are sufficiently intelligent to be encompassed within that designation. I would say, perhaps in terms of common sense or ubiquitous empirical observation, dogs and cats definitely need to be off limits, as should primates. Primates should be off limits for health reasons as well, since they're too genetically similar to us. And
it's interesting. Go ahead.
I agree with you, but technically the pig is on the same level as a dog and cat.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
And that is worth looking into, certainly. And this is one of the problems that in vitro meat can solve, because from the standpoint of how people get their sources of protein, some people are vegetarians today, but I think that's a fairly stable percentage of the population. And the people who are meat eaters today are not meat eaters for a lack of vegetarian alternatives. That may have been the case 30 or 40 years ago. But today, one can go to a grocery store and find an abundance of vegetarian products and simulacra of meat of varying degrees of authenticity. I eat a lot of veggie burgers and other veggie products myself, even though I'm not a vegetarian, because I find them to have an interesting and distinctive taste, which is not quite like the experience of eating meat. But for those who want that particular experience of eating meat, I think they need actual physical meat that is grown in a lab that doesn't require the killing of an animal. And that's when we might be able...
good soy alternatives, just for the consistency of meat.
Yes, I think there are a lot of products that can simulate at least certain aspects of eating meat fairly well. I would actually say chicken can be very readily emulated through vegetarian chicken, faux chicken patties that taste almost like actual chicken patties. With beef, I would say there are more differences, but that's just my personal experience.
But even that's changing with that new one that they're doing, the veggie meat patty that actually bleeds like a real meat patty, and that enhances the flavor in and of itself, and actually mimics, well, at least those who've taste tested it have claimed that it actually tastes like meat. So there are even advances in that regard as well, in terms of actually mimicking meat-based products using only veggie-based sources. So that's interesting. Martin?
Also, back to the ranking of animals to eat. Chickens are quite dumb. Like, you can't cut off the head of a pig and expect it to run around for 20 to 40 seconds. So I think of the mammals that you could eat, it is the dumbest and thus most reasonable to eat.
Well, that's my predominant meat source anyway, so I suppose that is somewhat of a relief. Now,
in that case, we should actually be eating axolotl, because we just cut off a piece and they'll regenerate. We're not killing anything. We're just eating axolotl.
Yes.
We're done.
Yes, so we have some more comments here. There is a debate about essentially which are the more objectively intelligent animals and how to define that. Super Thin Guy mentions cognitive ability as a criterion for intelligence. And of course, much has been said about the definition of intelligence, what counts as intelligence, to what extent do various animals have similar cognitive processes and a similar awareness of their own cognitive processes that we do. I think certainly whales and dolphins would probably have some kind of that awareness, and I wouldn't be surprised if dogs and cats do, given how I've observed them to react and behave, and the differences in personality that I've observed among individuals of those species. Keaki Angarika says, intelligence can be variously defined. I don't know that I try to force it too hard to fit specific single definitions, but as far as eating, I'm up for anything that isn't human. And Super Thin Guy states in psychology, intelligence is pretty defined. Keaki Angarika says, as far as growing meat, though I do like the idea and highly support the availability of lab meat as a way to decrease cost, increase safety and nutrition, and solve environmental issues. Helen Kenyon says, I think our definitions of intelligence speak more to our ability to understand than to any inherent intelligence or lack thereof in any one species. And Sean just posted a link internally to the Wikipedia entry on the theory of multiple intelligences. I'll just post it in the chat as well, so that people have it available. And yes, there are various dimensions along which psychologists have proposed measuring intelligence. To what extent do other species of animals have them? I think the comment by Helen Kenyon is apropos in the sense that we can recognize when a creature has attributes in common with us or doesn't. Would we be able to recognize the intelligent processes in an entity that is far more intelligent than ourselves? Let's say an artificial general intelligence that might develop capabilities that we don't have. How would they manifest themselves? Can a dog or a cat perceive intelligent processes in a human that a dog or a cat doesn't have? Or do they just think we're very big creatures kind of like them who happen to behave in certain ways that are advantageous to them. I'm opening this up to any thoughts you might have.
I think modeling of human behavior is beyond the modeling capacity of most animals. Most animals don't have a sense of time or the future. They're kind of stuck in this eternal now, which is one of the things that was kind of implied by the way we rank consciousness, but it's not directly obvious that when we talk about that modeling, that animals don't have this ability to model the world. So they can model maybe themselves and maybe other animals, and they really have a hard time modeling themselves. Animals don't know what choices they're going to make in the future, and they can't predict a choice. Chimps maybe, but most dogs and cats aren't they aren't thinking about the future. When a dog has 2 bones, the reason it has trouble deciding is because of its inability to model. So I definitely don't think that animals or cats and dogs are understanding humans to the same degree that humans are understanding cats and dogs for the same modeling limitation. And so when we talk about something like what would an AI do, we're talking about this type of modeling that's even beyond what we would model. And I think some things that people are afraid of, or at least have in the conspiracy theories of the internet, they worry that the models of the AI would be so complex as they would make these minor changes that would actually have, they would be able to control the butterfly effect, as it were, and make innocuous changes in different parts of the economy that would result in huge changes later on, but no one would be able to detect them because the modeling was so advanced that it was unpredictable. But I sometimes feel like this is mostly people's excuse for their own failings to predict mistakes to make.
And it's an interesting point you raised, because humans do have the capacity to model other entities. So we've kind of crossed a qualitative threshold here. On the other hand, can we detect, yes, something that seems to us to be innocuous, but can have tremendous ramifications? I think in retrospect, we can see situations where if some small event, at least from the vantage point of that time, didn't happen, then a large and consequential series of events would have unfolded differently. To what extent would an entity with a lot more access to information and a lot more processing abilities than we have be able to anticipate that without resorting to heuristics as human beings often have to because of the extreme complexity of the world in which we find ourselves? So that is an interesting question.
I think we've already seen something, although not with a general AI, but we've seen it with a specific AI when it came to the AlphaGo AI from Google that played against Lee Sedol, the current world champion in the ancient Chinese board game Go. That AlphaGo made a move, and not sure which round, but no one understood why it made that move until I think it was move 39. Then it became clear what it had actually done so many moves before. And in that sense, we might observe something that seems odd to us if a higher intelligence would do it, and we might not understand why it would do it. Only like later on, we might see the results of what it did, much as that, I don't know, an animal might see us throwing stuff on the soil and not have any idea why we're doing it until later it sees the results that grain is growing. Something like that.
Well, yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned AlphaGo because AlphaGo was back on the news here just a couple of days ago because Google created a brand new AlphaGo called AlphaGo Zero that when put into the difference between this new AlphaGo from the previous one that defeated all the human AlphaGo or the Go players was that this AlphaGo did not rely on any human bias, any type of human-based interactions in the practice of Go. It learned by combating against itself. And not only did it learn the game substantially faster, when it put it against the AlphaGo Zero against the previous AlphaGo that defeated all the humans, it defeated that original AlphaGo 100-0 in the amount of rounds. So that in and of itself is showing the acceleration of AI. This one, you know, if you put this up against humans in a game of Go, it's going to wipe them off the map. So we can already see where the acceleration of artificial intelligence in that capacity is already reaching a point of no return.
Yeah, and the original AlphaGo was slightly under slightly over a year ago. March 2016, if I recall correctly.
2016, and then they had another one earlier this year for rematches for other Go players, and even that one, it still hasn't. It's not able to keep up with this brand new one, which is fascinating to look at.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is indeed quite fascinating, and to relate this to some of the recent comments, Keaki Angarika says AI development will give us great insights into animal and human intelligence, and I agree. By observing a different form of intelligence, in some respects an intelligence more powerful than our own, we might be able to understand our own and what differentiates it from that, as well as what differentiates the animals from both of these forms of intelligence. Super Fin Guy says, don't forget about crows. Crows are also extremely intelligent. At one point in time, I believe, at least when I was a child, I encountered a crow that could count just by the number of emanations that it made. It seemed to be referring to kind of the number of objects in its vicinity. Like, I would feed the crow, I would throw like a little piece of bread to it, and it would crow once. If I threw 2 pieces of bread, it would crow twice. And I think it could count up to 3. I'm not sure if it could count beyond 3. But as a child, I kind of found that fascinating.
Crows are hyper-intelligent beings. There was that recent story where researchers were a bit baffled when they were doing one of those typical food scheme-based experiments where they would have to do a certain thing in order to get food. But a certain crow that was in the research field was so intelligent that it started hacking the experiment to operate in its favor. And so they had to take that crow out of the experiment because it was going way past what they were expecting. So that was fascinating in and of itself. That shows this crow is showing a level of intelligence that it's not going to play by our rules anymore. It's going to create its own rules to survive. And I think that in and of itself is fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Ben Westbrook says, scale up lab-grown beef to industrial scale, but tell people it was grown on a tree. Interesting. So that could get around the fears of the unnatural. We could have instead beef-growing trees, or at least the illusion thereof. And because they're trees, they're natural, quote unquote. And
I think that might fall under Uncanny Valley, maybe. I'm not sure.
It wouldn't even matter, because if you have like beef being grown and it's like it has the substance, like the consistence of minced meat, you either sell it as minced meat or you sell it as beef patties or something, and there's no way you would be able to tell the difference unless it tastes different.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Once these technologies become democratized and enter, the homes of anyone of the general population, it doesn't really matter what exactly it is. If there is going to be a demand for something, there's going to be that supply of it. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because one of the commentators mentioned that they don't care what they eat so long as it's not human. But interesting enough, there was that story of, well, what happens if someone were to create synthetic human flesh using the same processes as that of the lab-grown meats, would it still be considered cannibalism? And that it was bringing up an interesting philosophical question of, well, if it's still synthetic and we are adhering to the argument that it's not actually harming the animals, could we then apply it to the same thing as that of humans? And would people still find it gross and taboo, or would it be less taboo? And I'm not sure what my opinion is on that matter in particular, but it does raise certain philosophical questions on lab-grown meats in and of itself, especially as it becomes democratized and easily accessed to the general population.
I do know what we're going to call it if we eat synthetic human flesh. We're going to call it the Santa Clarita diet. Okay, for anyone who's catching. Okay, PJ is catching
of
reference.
course, yeah.
Imagine this. Imagine there's a grow your own meat at home kit, and it has all the parts for replicating the meat, and all you do is supply your own cells. At
You're
which point
eating
you supply your own
yourself.
cells. Now, would you eat that meat? I would.
Like, I don't know, like, unless I really taste bad. But
That would probably be a very awkward conversation during the dinner tables, just, galvanizing about just how good you taste.
yeah.
I don't think it would go well for a dinner conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the...
I'm pretty sure I would.
Sorry, I think I'm lowering the level here or something. Also, I think Gennady is freezing up.
Yeah, I believe he is.
He's stuck. He couldn't take it anymore.
At least he got him on his good side.
Yeah. Anyway, but that raises some interesting philosophical questions indeed. Whether that would be well, one, would it be ethical, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
There's a dude that's in like Siberia who's claiming to be the reincarnation of Jesus. Now, should they take his meat, and as part of the Christian tradition, where they eat the body of Christ, should they distribute his meat around, and then he could become the source of a bunch of...
Well, it would certainly raise up an interesting new religious principles, I suppose, in the future. It would certainly add on to the whole metaphor to it, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't like. Yeah, but I think that would be more like a biotheological question.
Possibly.
Like, yeah, not sure. Anyways, wow. Anyway, but I think Gennady is trying to reconnect.
Yes.
I never actually know.
Am I back?
Yes, you are.
Ah,
Excellent. Excellent.
audio-wise at least.
Up yet, but
Video is back too.
yes,
Wonderful.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Okay.
Hello.
Okay. So my apologies. This is my patchy internet service, which I have privately complained about and complained about to the internet service provider as well. But it looks like we are back up, and the video stream was uninterrupted during my absence, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I think the discussion was on synthetic simulacra of human flesh and whether consuming that would be considered cannibalism. And the point I wanted to make before I was cut off is historically the taboo against cannibalism evolved even in pre-scientific times when people couldn't quite figure out exactly what was wrong with it because of the adverse health consequences of eating genetically similar material to one's own, and various prion diseases have been caused by cannibalism, for instance. And I wonder if that wouldn't continue to be the case, if there were synthetic meats that were genetically identical to one's own meat, just in the very act of consuming those, perhaps one would be vulnerable to these kinds of diseases, and that wouldn't anymore be a moral argument from the standpoint of doing harm to somebody else. It would be more of a health argument. You shouldn't eat something that would harm you, irrespective of how it was obtained.
Even then, even if it were the case, given that level of technology that, or the power of that technology, we would be able to modify it to where it wouldn't necessarily mimic our own supposed DNA, or it wouldn't even cause the prions, but we would be in a position of power where we could modify it to the extent where it wouldn't bring up these sort of issues. At best, it would just cause more philosophical questions, or at worst, it would just make another interesting argument for the conspiracy theorist about how transhumanists are out to cannibalize the entire world.
Oh, yes. Speaking of which, this wasn't originated in the chat, but just as we were speaking, there were some comments posted to our Google group. By the way, if you're a member of the Transhumanist Party, you will be added to our Google group and be able to participate in these conversations. But one commenter says a lot of the conspiracy films online, including on YouTube, need to be countered with online discussions that explain how silly the conspiracy stuff is, and we can produce videos debunking them. And another commenter says, given the trend of alarmism in social media and the currents of bigotry and confirmation bias, I would be interested in seeing any realistic solutions. And these are, I think, important issues to consider, given that social media and the fragmentation of media in our era tend to create echo chambers where people reinforce beliefs even when those beliefs do not have a lot of evidentiary basis. And one example of that is that I recently came across a video that tried to cobble together video evidence suggesting that I am actually a cyborg. And I'm serious about this. And some of the evidence...
I'd be honored.
I had a post-law moment for a second there, like...
Yeah.
So I have those a lot where I'm like, is this real? Is this satire? I'm unsure. Please get me off this planet.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, precisely.
But
so
there are a lot of conspiracy theories, though, that especially that revolve around transhumanism, and they do make a point about where we do need to make a sort of serious effort to try and address them, because as much as we may dislike it, conspiracy theories are extremely popular, especially to younger adults, because that is when they start getting involved in politics for the first time, and conspiracy theories are really palatable for them because they're in that moment in their life where they're starting to question everything, and that is the very essence of conspiracy theorism, is to question everything. And it's sort of a beginner's politics. A lot of people, or most people, tend to wedge themselves out of it when they start learning to discipline the way that they question politics and what have you. But then there are still many who still fall, or at least they're trapped in that world because of paranoia and all the other types of issues that keeps them in such a crazy mindset. And it is something that we're going to have to address, especially as a community.
It's a lack of critical thinking skills. So the issue that we're talking about here is that there's a questioning skepticism, and then there's this questioning skepticism too much. And conspiracies definitely isn't to the too much, where knowledge becomes completely subjective.
Yeah.
And the tools to be able to overcome that are critical thinking skills, which are unfortunately not a part of most standard K through 12 curriculums, and is actually a specialized course if you actually make it to college.
Yeah,
so that's kind of
I taught that course, by the way. Anyway, sorry.
It's what it is.
Yes, and it's extremely important. I agree. And I think one of the fundamental problems in the mindset of any conspiracy theorist is the desire to see significance in every incidental aspect. Like, one of the reasons why I'm allegedly a cyborg is because in a lot of my earlier videos, I am never seen to blink. And the reason why I'm never seen to blink is actually because of the low frame rate of those videos, because blinking happens so quickly that frame rate doesn't capture it. But to a conspiracy theorist, it just seems unnatural. So why isn't this guy blinking? Oddly enough, some have alleged that my hair couldn't possibly be real, and therefore I am a cyborg. And I can assure you that I am not wearing a wig, and that this is not some sort of robotic hair.
Typical excuse, Gennady. Just come out the closet. Come on.
For ease of use, they would make a cyborg bald. So, not dropping any hints. Just
You don't have to worry about that, Martin. You're perfectly fine.
You can also run really far, almost inhuman, I would say.
Yes, but this is how conspiracy theories originate. Little incidental, conceptually irrelevant facts get cobbled together into a narrative, and then they each individually get pointed to as kind of reinforcing the overall conspiracy. And somebody who engages in critical thinking can say, well, there are alternative explanations for each of them. But if somebody spends enough time building up the conspiracy, they become invested in it. And then it's very difficult to debunk, even when each individual piece can be debunked. Furthermore, it's a lot faster to assert a ridiculous claim than it is to take the time to go into detail about why it's false.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly you end up buying a water filter because the frogs are turning gay or something.
Right. Well, when I was doing work with the AI company Humai, we ended up running into one of those situations where we were having to deal with a bunch of conspiracy theorists as well, where they were so adamant that under Humai that it was secretly a lab that was cloning little children so that we could share them with the rest of the community to cannibalize. And that was something that they seriously believed, and they started targeting people's names and putting up online saying these are the people that are cloning your children and eating them. And we had to deal with that for several months. And it was so absurd that we weren't sure if it was just satire or if these people were this mentally deranged, and weren't sure how could someone address someone that is like that. Can we even bring them out of that type of mindset, or do we need to make proactive decisions on making sure that other people don't fall into that trap of this absurdity of conspiracy theorism that could serve as a big detriment to one's own mental health?
Yes. Yes, and I think it's important to understand when communicating with the public, we're not really trying to, as our foremost objective, persuade the people who are deeply invested in these conspiracy theories or any other kind of fallacious thinking. We're largely trying to reach the people who are undecided. They may be open-minded. They may just be trying to go on with the daily course of their lives, but they're trying to figure out what to think about a particular set of issues. And unfortunately, sometimes a conspiracy theory, especially when it's superficially appealing, will reach some reasonable people who might not give it a second thought and might just accept the loudest voices in the discussion. So one big challenge is how to counter the conspiracy theories without giving them too much credence. And there are different positions on that. For instance, in the whole debate on intelligent design, some scientists who know that evolution exists and is an established fact believe that they shouldn't even debate intelligent design proponents, because that would be giving them a platform, and that would be, in effect, legitimizing their views through engagement. But others say, well, if you don't debate them, if you don't debunk them, if you don't actively engage them, then they're just going to spread their fallacies, and they're going to say, well, these people in the establishment, they don't want to participate in the discussion. They're afraid. What are they afraid of? And we do see conspiracy theorists saying that, but it's a difficult dilemma, because it depends on the conspiracy, and it depends on how powerful it would become if it isn't challenged, or whether it would just be confined to its own little echo chamber.
We were shown an example of that, where the famous debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham, where he debated intelligent design as opposed to evolution, and he made several great remarks, and obviously those in the scientific community saw that Bill Nye was the ultimate victor, that he was able to, point by point, show how Ken Ham was absolutely wrong in every regard in his worldview of history and of the species. But then again, those who follow Ken Ham maintain their point of view, and that becomes the issue of, it brings up that same question: is it even worth debating these people? Should we debate them? Should we put ourselves on the front line in their place, in their time, and spend our time addressing them, or should we just try and help people, prevent them from falling in that line of thinking to begin with?
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And I think there's also another dimension to this, which is the emotional or psychological dimension with regard to what motivates people to be drawn to conspiracy theories. And that is, I think a lot of people have the desire to feel special, like they have a certain insight that other people do not. And getting genuinely new insights that nobody else has come up with before is difficult, just like scientific discovery is difficult. And for most of our knowledge, most of us have to rely on what has been developed and discovered by others. And that's the best we can do, because we cannot reinvent either the physical or the metaphorical wheel. But the conspiracy theorists have this emotional high that they get off of thinking, well, we know something that the rest of the world doesn't know, that the rest of the world doesn't want to know. We're special. And if we can just get the people to see what we know and they don't know, then everything will be better. Or they themselves will be in a position of greater prominence, greater recognition, greater respect. And I think some of the people who are so heavily invested in their conspiracy theories are that invested because the ideas have become a part of their identity. And they worry about what would become of them, what would become of their sense of self if the conspiracy were false, which is why they cling so vehemently to that. And the most unfortunate conspiracies are the ones that do real world damage to real people, like the anti-vaccination conspiracy, where again, every single element of this whole vaccines cause autism narrative has been debunked. And the original researcher, in quotes, who started this conspiracy theory, Andrew Wakefield, has been shown to have conducted fraud in his original study. He has been deprived of his medical license. The paper he published was retracted, and yet the conspiracy theory continues.
Even with anti-GMO as well, it's affecting where golden rice that provides an enhanced level of vitamin A to regions where vitamin A deficiencies are very much prevalent and is quite harmful to the general population. The conspiracy theories against GMOs has caused a lot of countries that would need golden rice to the governments there are not willing to allow those types of crops to enter their country in fear of what they've heard of them. And that brings up more problematic issues of how conspiracy theories pervades reason and rationality. It's just one of those issues that we have to take by a step-by-step basis, in my opinion, because of just, despite how simplistic conspiracy theories are, they also have their own level of complexity of what needs to be addressed and what just needs to be ignored.
Yes.
I think there's another aspect to the GMO. Oh, Sean, you go first.
So, sure. So one of the things I want to point out about the GMOs is there are things that are related to GMOs that are unhealthy, and that's specifically the types of pesticides that they use that are catered to specific GMOs. But that's not the GMOs themselves that are unhealthy.
You're referring to glyphosate.
Yeah, glyphosate, and there was one other one that I can't remember right now, but also neonicotinoids.
The thing though with the glyphosate though is, first of all, it's an herbicide, not a pesticide. But even then, glyphosate, even though it contains a certain level of toxicity where it's not exactly the healthiest thing that you would want to consume. You know, the conspiracy theorists, for one, they would use up the general argument. They would, why don't you consume a glass of glyphosate? Yeah, they would consume the glass of glyphosate, see if it would improve. But the problem is, glyphosate is the safest herbicide on the market right now, which is the general argument that at this moment right now, if farmers are going to be using herbicides, they should use glyphosate because it is the safest, which isn't to say that it is safe in and of itself. It is merely the safest alternative that we have. Say that again?
So here's the issue. It's only designed specifically for GMO crops. It doesn't work on non-GMO crops because it just kills them because of the aspect of it that is genetically modified. The difference that I'm trying to point out here is that people are afraid of the wrong things. They're afraid of the genetic modification when in fact, although the WHO says something differently, the point that I'm making is it's something that they're spraying on the crops that is the actual dangerous thing, not the GMO themselves. So this is where critical thinking really comes in important, because people are mistaking that it's because they're GMO that they're bad, when in fact what people are complaining about is that Monsanto has had control of this media and a lot of other crap that has allowed them to downplay the threats of this type of thing that is specific to their GMO crops, and then mistaking that to be true of all GMO crops, which is actually false.
Well, at the same time, also we also have to consider that it's not necessarily glyphosate in and of itself. We have to keep in mind the accumulation of what the intake of glyphosate. It's the same thing with topics like radiation and chemicals and toxins. When people fear about toxins, what they should be talking about is the toxicity rate. When they're talking about radiation, we should be talking about the accumulation of certain radiation. We get background radiation all the time that isn't harmful to us. We receive radioactive isotopes when we eat a banana because it contains potassium. And the same thing applies with glyphosate. It depends on the intake of the glyphosate, and that needs to have proper regulations, of which Monsanto doesn't even have control over anymore because they don't even have the patent on glyphosate because they lost it back in 2000. In fact, the biggest manufacturer of glyphosate today is China. Monsanto doesn't even have control over that anymore.
Yes, and this is interesting. I see another parallel here to a practice that is commonly feared by the public, and there is some reason for concern, and that is hydraulic fracturing. But the fear is hydraulic fracturing can lead to both earthquakes and contamination of drinking water. But the issue is, again, one of separating the activity that actually does the harm from the activity that may still be innocuous. It is not actually the fracturing itself that increases either one of those risks. It is the injection of the wastewater that is a byproduct of the hydraulic fracturing underground. So it's the underground wastewater injection that tends to trigger earthquakes along faults, or create earthquakes where there is not a lot of natural seismic activity. Likewise, a lot of that wastewater, because of the chemicals used in it, is indeed hazardous to people's health if they drink it. But it's not actually the process of horizontal drilling that extracts fossil fuels from the ground that leads to these problems. And if there weren't these wastewater injection wells, maybe hydraulic fracturing would be a lot safer. So that's another example, I think, of the need to understand what goes on in a particular process, and if there are multiple processes used simultaneously, which one of them is actually bad. That's an important critical thinking skill to have. Now, I'd like to address a few comments about conspiracy theories that have been posted. So Keaki Angarika says, perhaps they, the conspiracy theorists, have a tendency not to question the theories themselves. They fall into a similar trap to religious fundamentals. And then, yes, maintaining the conspiracy theory, I think, requires a certain suspension of skepticism, even though the conspiracy theorists think they're the utmost skeptics, they can see through everything, but on the other hand, they become beholden to their own narratives, in a sense.
We see right through you, Gennady, in your cyborg ways.
Was I programmed to give the perfect response to conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists in general? Well, look, you should get in contact with Ben Goertzel, because he's been designing these humanoid robots, but I think my design could give him a lot of insights into, say, facial expressions, gestures, how to make his robots more responsive to in-person conversations, if he's interested in drawing insights from that.
Yeah, we'll work on the blinking problem later.
I wonder where you have your Cyberdyne barcode.
Oh, that's funny.
But another aspect of conspiracy theorism people need to keep in mind is that there is some of it, because when I first got into politics, I was, myself, I was into the conspiracy theories for a little while, and over time I got myself out of it. But the one thing that I noticed with a lot of them was that there was a genuine sense of distrust in those in power, and with that, there is a bit of leeway for us to insert ourselves to try and provide solutions to ensure that they get out of that certain mindset. And for us here at the Transhumanist Party, we are making active ways of trying to address distrust in those in power through the implementation of possible surveillance policies that would help bring about more open transparency between those in power and those of the general population. And that in and of itself could help alleviate a lot of the conspiracy theories that pervade us.
Yes, yes, indeed. And some further comments. Keaki Angarika says, it would take a great deal of new information to change the facts that have led me to becoming and remaining a transhumanist. And I would agree with that. I think transhumanism as a philosophy and as a set of goals is based on mainstream facts and potentials that exist within established mainstream science. It's just a matter of humankind essentially actualizing that potential, taking it a step further. Transhumanism as a philosophy and as a set of goals doesn't require embracing any sorts of, quote, alternative facts, anything that the scientific community or the public at large would reject as being the case if they understood the existing bodies of knowledge in various disciplines as they've been developed. Super Fin Guy says, I believe in some conspiracies, and believe me, they make me very sad, not the contrary. So it's interesting, too, what he would consider a conspiracy, though, because prior to Edward Snowden's revelations in 2013, I think most people would have said the idea that the national security agency in the United States is spying on everybody's emails and phone calls would be a crazy conspiracy theory. Yet in that case, it would have been a correct understanding of the world by those who actually knew the facts. So I think in the sense that we're using it, a conspiracy theory is one that can be readily refuted by the facts at hand if one took a sufficiently in-depth look at them. But the people who are invested in it have created their own echo chamber that makes them impervious to that refutation, at least in the short term. What do you think about that distinction in terms of what would be considered a conspiracy theory to begin with?
Well, the fundamental difference, in my opinion, between a conspiracy theory and an actual conspiracy is the fact that an actual conspiracy has a lot of evidence to back it up. So long a certain theory of a conspiracy contains absolutely no evidence, can be refuted using basic rationality and the evidence at hand, it should remain a conspiracy theory and not be given much weight. But if evidence is presented where it can be observed and accounted for in the same way that the scientific process goes in peer review, where people further study and can provide similar results and provide similar evidence, then the conspiracy theory can then be accepted as an actual conspiracy. But until then, if it cannot survive scientific scrutiny, then it shouldn't be given any notice whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think right now, because we are past the 2-hour mark, I would like to encapsulate a few more of the comments that have been made, and then we could each go to our respective closing statements to summarize and perhaps develop upon the insights drawn from this discussion. Keaki Angarika says, every technology we are developing can and will go in a negative direction to some extent. Humans will use tools for good and ill, as they always have. However, we have every reason to believe that on the whole, these things will produce more good than ill. And that really is the techno-optimist perspective that transhumanists pretty much universally embrace, that on the whole, technology will have more good effects than ill effects. And yes, technology introduces some risks, but further technological development combined with rational and moral thinking would be the best way to counter those risks and mitigate, if not prevent them. And Ben Westbrook comments on that thread, I believe that they will, in terms of having more good effects than ill ones, unless we have an unusual level of secrecy or proprietary stuff surrounding it, or a monoculture of willful ignorance of science, which it could be argued we have to some degree. And we also have to some degree in terms of various intellectual property regimes, at the very least an overly strict proprietary control of a lot of technologies, as we observe with software patents or medical patents, for instance. Does anyone else have thoughts on that thread of conversation? I suppose then we can move on. And this is interesting. Keaki Angarika says, sadly, I would agree, our general level of scientific understanding is still far too low. It is an area that we should put more emphasis on, since the transhuman is partly dependent on public support. Super Fin Guy says, some people say they are against conspiracy theories, but they have no problem believing the ones that align with their ideology. And that's true. We have conspiracy theories that tend to have affinities on the left or affinities on the right. For instance, I would say more people on the left are drawn to the anti-GMO conspiracy than people on the right. On the other hand, more people on the right are drawn to the conspiracy that climate change is a hoax, for instance, than people on the left. Well,
anti-science hysteria is, it has no particular ideology. it seeps its way into every ideology throughout the entire political spectrum. You know, with the left, there's the anti-GMOs, there are the anti-vaxxers. With the right wing, there's the anti-abortion, the climate change is a hoax. You know, we have to make it an active policy for people that whenever anti-science or pseudoscience rears its ugly head, we should combat it regardless of what political ideology it hides behind.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think the question that should be asked is, are people engaging in certain motivated reasoning? Like, if certain facts in their view are the way they are, does that help them with their political agenda? And the correct response to that is to say facts should not be used in that way. Science should not be misdirected in that way, because the proper sequence of considerations is not what do we want a preconceived outcome to be, now how can we fit the facts to justify it? It should be rather, what are the facts? And in response to the facts, what, if anything, should be done? And for instance, on the subject of climate change, one can have many different proposals for how to address climate change. Anthropogenic climate change may be impossible to address through some sort of central plan. It may be necessary for, say, market-based solutions or technologies to develop. But if scientific evidence points in a certain direction, the correct answer isn't to say, oh, the assertions of fact are fraudulent. It's rather to say, okay, let's consider carefully the policy implications. If we don't like carbon taxation, or we don't think it would work, what are some better alternatives to deal with anthropogenic climate change? Or one potential position might even be, it is a fact, it is happening, and there is no policy to effectively address that. Now, that's not my view on the subject, but it is at least a logically conceivable view that doesn't require a conspiracy theory or an attempt to challenge the science on it.
I believe that Ramez Nam made good arguments on this in regards to how do we effectively introduce legislation that would address climate change to those of certain political ideologies, like the right wing, who for a lot of them, they don't even believe climate change exists. How do we implement policies that would address climate change to them? And the way he addressed it was, don't focus so much on trying to prove that climate change exists to them. Introduce legislation that speaks their language. Talk about energy policies. Talk about jobs and the amount of profits that would come out of green energy sector. That would help address climate change, all the while getting a more bipartisan viewpoint and policy decision-making in the process.
Yes, certainly, and that could help bypass the issue. One of my arguments for transitioning toward alternatives to fossil fuels has been that whether or not climate change, anthropogenic climate change exists, transitioning away from fossil fuels, when it becomes technologically and economically feasible, is desirable in any case because of the many other benefits, the prevention of oil spills or pipeline ruptures or air pollution that can be damaging to human health, or just the sheer inconvenience of having to refuel your car with a liquid every so often. But in any event, I do think it's a good time for closing comments. And let's start with you, Martin.
Well, I think I thought this was a really good Q&A. It definitely was a lot smoother than the first one. I mean, we had some technical difficulties. Although you had a really small technical difficulty, but luckily it didn't crash the whole live Q&A, so that was good. I overall really enjoyed this Q&A. I think we've learned a lot in terms of handling questions and talking through things, and we're getting more familiar with how to do it, and that's really cool. Obviously, I hope this will be inspiring to members, and that they might join. More of them might join us here in a next live Q&A session. And I think there's a lot of good feedback that we can work with too, in order to improve how we communicate with the public and our members and so on and so forth. And for that, I'd like to thank everyone.
Absolutely. And I would completely echo those sentiments, Martin. Sean, what closing thoughts would you like to offer us?
Well, I'm pro thorium, as for our energy systems. I agree. I am also glad with the way things went. Aside from my initial technical difficulties and continuing ones with my camera, but either way, or maybe I'm technically a cyborg. I hope we can coordinate more with our international ambassadors, maybe get them to show up onto these chats, or maybe actually request them to do specials about their own country or issues they face or want ideas for. But it's getting rolling here. It's getting good.
Excellent. Yes, and I agree with getting the ambassadors involved. Hopefully we'll start seeing some status reports from them, and any events that they organize or host, we would certainly be happy to feature and spread to others. Now, BJ, what closing thoughts do you have?
Well, first and foremost, apologies for coming in a little bit late, as we've all had to go through our own technical difficulties, but this Q&A was rather eventful, and definitely provides a lot of answers for us, and then certainly provides more questions for us as well to start answering, as goes the scientific process itself. I hope to see a lot more of these Q&As in the near future. And as an aside, I would like to at least make it known for those listening in, or those who will listen in. The United States Transhumanist Party have also been doing a campaign for foreign ambassadors. I would like to extend the invitation to people who are listening in, who want to come into the Q&As and use it as a baseline to determine whether or not they like to join us in that capacity if they're from a foreign country. We would love to have you. Either I or Gennady can provide you links for that, and we look forward to seeing more of you join in with these Q&As and join us here at the party.
Absolutely. And actually, in the description of the Q&A on YouTube, there is a link to the application to become a foreign ambassador, along with the link to our general membership application. To become a foreign ambassador, one should be a member of the Transhumanist Party as well. Even if you don't live in the United States or are not eligible to vote in the United States, you can still become an allied member. And that application is very straightforward. The foreign ambassador process requires more details about who you are, what you do, what your areas of interest are, because you would be representing the party in an important capacity. But we welcome that sort of engagement, and hopefully at some point we'll have a foreign ambassador in every country. And that way we will continue to build a truly international transhumanist movement. So thank you very much to everybody for participating. The last comment that I see so far from Keaki Angarika is, given the success of this, I would suggest regularly scheduled H+, i.e. transhumanist chats, not necessarily ones that revolve around a panel, but open to all interested participants. And one thing I would recommend is using our Google group for that purpose, or using our general discussion threads on the US Transhumanist Party website for that purpose, because a lot of interesting conversations transpire there that wouldn't easily fit into a video format, but they are also worthwhile, and they have a record, and we can draw upon that record for further ideas and further discussions. So with that, thank you everybody. Thank you to our officers, and thank you to our viewers for the interesting questions and comments. I hope you have a good remainder of your day.
Likewise.